The clock struck 9:06 a.m. The Helix Dynamics data center blacked out completely. CEO Victoria Kane, known for her ruthless efficiency, watched her senior engineers, costing thousands per hour, fail to start the critical backup generator. Millions in losses ticked by. The air grew thick with panic. A lead engineer announced, "We need 3 hours for diagnostics." Victoria, desperate and furious, noticed Daniel Foster, the quiet 40-year-old single dad who cleaned the floors. She pointed, her voice slicing the air. "Fix this in 10 minutes. I will kiss you right here and now." The room froze in stunned silence, but Daniel only looked up, his expression perfectly calm. Daniel Foster, the man now standing under the CEO's scornful gaze, wasn't an engineer in the corporate sense. He was a contract facilities maintenance technician. His uniform was practical, not prestigious. He had no glittering university degrees to impress anyone on the Helix Dynamics payroll. His authority extended only as far as ensuring the coffee machine worked, the plumbing flowed, and the lights ironically stayed on when the main power was functioning. Daniel's primary, non-negotiable career requirement was time. He reported early every single day, precisely at 6 a.m., working with methodical, quiet efficiency so he could clock out exactly at 3 p.m. This schedule was non-negotiable. His son, 8-year-old Oliver, whose severe learning difficulties required a specialized afternoon program, depended entirely on Daniel's precise timing. Daniel was a single father. His life was a meticulously planned rhythm of work and parenting. To him, the stability of a paycheck and the flexibility of his contract were more valuable than any executive title or seven-figure salary. Consequently, the senior engineering staff, who dealt only in theoretical models, network latency, and quarterly metrics, rarely noticed Daniel. They treated him as a piece of background infrastructure, as interchangeable and uninteresting as a filter or a fuse. They called him the janitor who touches wires. They certainly never considered that the man cleaning up spilled water might be more intimately acquainted with the building's power spine than they were. Victoria Kane, the CEO, was a figure of relentless, high-pressure efficiency. She was brilliant, driven, and known for her blunt, often cruel honesty. Her belief system was rigid. Success was earned through visible degrees, prestigious titles, and aggressive command. She had zero patience for inefficiency or, worse, expertise that couldn't be quantified on a dashboard. Her contempt for contract men and outsiders was well known. To Victoria, Daniel represented the disposable, the predictable, the opposite of the high-stakes world she inhabited. The immediate pressure on Victoria was astronomical. Just last week, she had lost a monumental acquisition deal worth nearly $1 billion due to a separate minor technical glitch that had spiraled into a catastrophic system failure. This loss, internally dubbed Project Phoenix, had been blamed on the engineering team's lack of practical oversight. The stock market had reacted violently, and her board was demanding immediate, visible results. This new total power failure, barely a week later, was threatening to sink her company, her reputation, and her career. The financial pressure had curdled into a volatile rage, making her quick to snap, desperate for a solution, and prone to reckless, sarcastic outbursts, like the challenge she had just issued. The insult was calculated, not just a challenge, but a public humiliation designed to assert her absolute dominance, even over the most peripheral staff member. She needed a scapegoat. She found a target. Daniel, standing calmly, was the only one in the room who hadn't physically tensed when the power died. He had been performing a routine check nearby and had heard the sound of the generator attempting to start. He wasn't relying on the array of expensive sensors that had all failed to identify the problem. He was listening to the raw, visceral sound of the machine itself, a skill honed during years in remote, hostile environments, where a working generator was the only barrier between survival and disaster. He had instantly recognized a specific, unusual vibration rhythm, a subtle acoustic signature that was entirely wrong. It wasn't the heavy, grinding clunk of a deep mechanical fault, which would require hours to fix. It was a high-frequency, electronic shudder, like a tremor of internal anxiety, a machine trying to fire but being held back by an unseen electronic restraint. The failure was soft, a systemic refusal, not a hard, catastrophic break. The engineers, blinded by their monitors and software, were focused on testing fuel lines and ignition sequences. They were looking for a hard failure. Daniel knew the failure was soft, a systemic refusal. Daniel showed zero reaction to the KISS challenge. His gaze remained steady, fixed on the silent, monolithic machine. He didn't defend his status, he didn't complain, and he didn't even acknowledge the insult. He simply spoke the only words necessary to proceed. "Ms. Kane," Daniel said, his voice flat and controlled, "with respect to the team's efforts, may I listen to the machine? Just listen." Mark, the senior engineer who had estimated the 3-hour delay, snickered loudly, earning nervous laughter from his peers. "Listen? Listening won't fix the fuel injector pump, Daniel. You need a wrench, not an ear." Mark believed in the gospel of digital diagnostics. Daniel's request was pure medieval superstition to him. Victoria, her arms tightly crossed beneath her expensive suit jacket, looked from Daniel to the rapidly clicking damage counter. She was out of options. She gave a curt, impatient nod, signaling permission with a dismissive wave. "Fine. You have 10 minutes. Do whatever primitive ritual you need to." The silence in the room was now absolute, broken only by the hum of the emergency lights and the low, heavy breathing of the anxious executives. Daniel walked slowly toward the massive, silent generator. He didn't rush, didn't panic, and didn't touch a single tool. He simply knelt down beside the machine, placing his hand gently on the cold metal casing. He then slowly closed his eyes, focusing only on the subtle, deep language of the inert engine. Daniel remained motionless beside the generator, his hand pressed against the cold metal. He spoke without opening his eyes, his voice carrying the deep resonance of concentration. "Please," he requested gently, "turn off all the emergency measuring devices and the local ventilation fans. I need absolute silence. The system noise is masking the error signal, the subtle click of the safety lock." The senior engineers exchanged incredulous glances. Turning off the equipment tracking the crisis seemed absurd, counterintuitive to all their training, especially Mark, who lived by his digital twin readout. But Victoria, her face pale with stress and curiosity, snapped, "Do it. Now. Total silence. Every second is costing us a fortune." The engineers complied, and the technical room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, a silence that felt louder than any alarm. The humidity, unchecked by the stopped air conditioning, intensified the feeling of pressure and doom. Victoria checked the clock. 5 minutes gone. She internally calculated the loss, over $250,000 in that silent 5 minutes. She tried to reconcile the man kneeling before her, a maintenance worker, with the solution she desperately needed. Her internal monologue was a cascade of self-justification. "Even if he fails, it proves my engineers are useless. If he succeeds, it proves my assumptions are fundamentally wrong." Daniel kept his ear pressed almost painfully close to the generator's thick metal casing. He wasn't listening for a loud fault. He was listening for the precise, repeating rhythm of a non-fault. Specifically, he was listening for the clear, sharp thwack of the fuel pre-injector solenoid, a sound that only happens when all primary safety parameters are satisfied and the system commits to ignition. He heard the faint click, click, click of the electronic safety trying to clear itself, but that distinct thwack was absent. The machine was refusing to transition from safe mode to active mode. He stayed there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 minutes, absorbing the machine's subtle acoustic profile. Victoria, clutching her phone and watching the countdown timer she had set, tightened her lips, her impatience of physical presence in the room. Finally, Daniel stood up. He didn't dust off his uniform or acknowledge the onlookers. He spoke to the machine, but for the benefit of the room. "It is not broken," Daniel stated with quiet, absolute certainty. "It is in a self-locking state. The system is refusing to fire because the parameters for a safe shutdown were never cleared." Mark, the lead engineer, immediately surged forward, displaying his console. "That is fundamentally impossible, Daniel. The sensors show all safeties were cleared. Look, the fuel line pressure is nominal, the oil is nominal, the air intake is clear. We cycled the reset sequence twice. Every sensor says the machine is ready. Mark's frustration was now panic. His reliance on the digital twin data was his fatal flaw. The data showed green, so the problem couldn't exist. Daniel didn't look at the screen. He pointed instead, high above their heads, toward a dark patch on the ceiling near the main HVS exhaust. Look at the ceiling. The internal room temperature has exceeded the mandatory thermal threshold for immediate ignition and stable operation. It's a passive environment-based safety lockout. The thermal sensors inside the generator itself are reading the ambient heat and initiating an automatic, irreversible stop to prevent a cascade thermal failure when the engine goes full load. Your sensors are reading the machine parameters correctly, but they're not reading the room parameters accurately because the environment itself is the error. Honey. Daniel then walked swiftly and calmly to the back wall, where a small, almost hidden emergency thermal vent door was located. It was designed to open automatically, but was clearly jammed due to a rusted hinge, something none of the sensor-reliant engineers had physically checked. The digital systems had neglected to track this single mechanical point of failure. He pulled sharply on the release handle, and the door scraped open, letting in a sudden rush of slightly cooler, outside air, a vital influx of oxygen. He then reached down and precisely adjusted a tiny, almost invisible pressure safety valve, a mechanism designed to monitor a secondary overflow tank, but often forgotten in routine inspections. It was a single, light, surgical touch. The thermal safety required the ambient air pressure to equalize, Daniel explained simply. This jammed vent and the misaligned valve were creating a localized vacuum around the external thermal sensor, signaling a false overheat. When we tried the first start, the engine was choked for oxygen and the heat immediately spiked, causing an immediate electronic override. The engine is fine. The environment is wrong. He stepped back and signaled to Mark. Try to start it now. Mark, still stunned and humiliated, stammered a command. The massive generator rumbled to life with a fierce, deep roar, shaking the concrete floor, and then abruptly sputtered and died again, just as Daniel had predicted it would, without the environmental correction. A wave of disappointed murmuring and cynical whispers swept the room. Mark looked briefly vindicated. See? It's a deep mechanical failure. Your theory was wrong. Daniel raised his hand, his eyes still calm, and held up a single index finger. One more time. The initial choke is now cleared. The pressure is equalizing. Victoria, who had been breathing silently but heavily throughout the process, slowly nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and frantic hope. Her 10-minute countdown clock had barely reached the 9-minute mark. She was holding her breath, not daring to speak, now fully realizing the difference between data and diagnosis. Mark, now desperate, hit the ignition sequence again. This time the engine caught. It roared, settled, and then began to pulse with a deep, steady, powerful hum. The perfect, life-giving rhythm of a machine returned to order. The green indicator lights on the main power panel flashed to life. Immediately, the air conditioning system throughout the data center hissed back into action, and the entire building, including the conference room, was flooded with bright, clean, stable power. The crisis, the million-dollar ticking clock, stopped. The generator hummed steadily, a deep, powerful sound of restored control. The transition from suffocating silence and failure to blinding, humming functionality was instantaneous and absolute. The returning light, the blinding, unforgiving light of the operational data center, caused every single person in the room to flinch. The sudden rush of cool, conditioned air hit their hot, sweat-dampened faces, a physical shock of relief and change. Server screens across the entire floor of the facility flickered back to life, flooding the complex with the green and blue glow of millions of active transactions. The enormous weight of corporate failure had been lifted in 9 minutes and 20 seconds. A few scattered, nervous claps started, quickly dying in the heavy, expectant silence. The freeze moment was total. All eyes were locked on Daniel and Victoria. Victoria Kane stood absolutely still, her mind replaying her arrogant, crude challenge. If you can fix this in 10 minutes, I will kiss you right here and now. Baikenway, the shame, the humiliation, and the sudden acute relief of saving her company from certain ruin collided in her expression. Her usually severe, controlled face was a kaleidoscope of stunned emotions, a raw mixture of professional gratitude and personal mortification. She forced herself to move. Her designer heels clicked deliberately on the concrete floor as she walked forward, the sound amplifying her internal struggle. Every step was visibly difficult, a public march toward the fulfillment of a foolish, drunken promise she'd made in a sober crisis. She had offered a crude kiss as a reward for a job she assumed was impossible for a man she had dismissed. She stopped a foot away from Daniel. The entire team, the senior engineers, the technical directors, and Mark, held their collective breath, witnessing a corporate humiliation unlike any they had ever experienced. They waited with dread and expectation for her to either follow through on the kiss or attempt to deny her words. Victoria stopped a foot away from Daniel. Her cheeks flushed a deep, painful red, a raw sign of her utter embarrassment. The 10 minutes had passed and the machine was running perfectly. The debt was due. Daniel, however, didn't move. He didn't look triumphant or expectant. He met her gaze with the same unshakable, quiet calm he had shown when he first knelt down, his expression radiating a profound, dignified authority. Then came Ms. Kane, Daniel said, his voice softer than the generator's hum. Yet it was the only sound anyone could clearly hear. The machine is working. The crisis is over. I don't need or want that reward. That was a transaction born of your panic, and I don't trade my value for insults disguised as prizes. The room was instantly, utterly silent, a silence even heavier than the power outage. The tension, which should have broken with the return of power, remained dangerously high, charged by the CEO's embarrassment and Daniel's stunning, dignified refusal. Daniel continued, his eyes unwavering, allowing her no escape. I only require what I asked for. Respect. Respect for the actual physical truth over the convenient lie that was being pursued, and respect for the person doing the work, regardless of the uniform they wear. Victoria swallowed hard, struggling to regain her composure. But Daniel wasn't finished. He had one more layer of truth to reveal, a truth that dismantled her entire corporate worldview in one sentence. I am not a mere contractor, Ms. Kane, Daniel stated, speaking clearly to the entire room. My uniform might be maintenance, but my history is design. The reason I knew the exact protocol of the safety valve and the acoustic signature of the internal system is because I spent 12 years as a chief design engineer for advanced mobile power systems, specifically military-grade generators designed for high-altitude, extreme temperature deployment. In my world, the environment always failed before the machine, which is why I checked the thermal vent before the fuel line. He paused, letting the magnitude of that title, Chief Design Engineer for Military Systems, sink into the ears of the high-end civilian engineers, who suddenly felt intensely unqualified. I left that life, Daniel continued, his voice dropping slightly, touching on the only vulnerable point he possessed. My wife passed away in a traffic accident 8 years ago. Oliver, my son, needed a father who was physically present, not one who was constantly deployed or locked in a secure design facility. I left the 24-hour constant travel and high security demands of that industry to take a predictable, hourly job that allows me to be present for my son, Oliver. My priority is his well-being, not corporate titles. I chose the predictable quiet of this job over the unpredictable chaos of high finance and high design. Oumana, the head of IT, pale and shaking, immediately pulled up Daniel's outdated personnel file from the now working system. He read the shocking truth aloud, his voice trembling. Daniel Foster's previous clearances, his military contracts, and the final astonishing detail. Daniel was one of the lead authors of the original, highly specific operational and maintenance documents for this exact model of industrial generator. The profile included a long-expired top-secret clearance designation, highlighting the true dangerous weight of his history. The man they had laughed at and offered a crude prize had literally written the book they were supposed to follow. Victoria took a deep, shuddering breath. The silence was finally broken by her. She did the only thing left that could possibly save her integrity. She slowly, deliberately bowed her head, not just to Daniel, but to the entire room and the power of the undeniable truth. "Mr. Foster," she said, her voice loud, clear, and ringing with sincere regret, "I was unprofessional, arrogant, and dangerously wrong. I apologize to you, and I apologize to my entire team for my failure in leadership and judgment. Your knowledge saved this company." She lifted her head, her eyes focused. "The machine is running perfectly because one man chose to listen to reality instead of our deadlines. The lesson is learned, and it will redefine how we operate." Daniel simply turned back to his station, picking up a clipboard as if the biggest moment of his life had never occurred. He had faced down the CEO, rejected her power play, and saved her company, all without raising his voice or claiming a victory. Within minutes of the generator stabilizing, Victoria Kane called an emergency. Short meeting right there in the buzzing technical room. She didn't retreat to the boardroom. She chose the scene of her failure to cement her change in leadership style. She began the meeting with a second, more formal apology, directed this time to Daniel and then extended to the entire team. "I let panic override professionalism. I allowed my pride to create a catastrophic risk. That will not happen again. The culture changes now." Victoria then turned to Daniel and made a new, serious offer. "Daniel, I am immediately creating the position of Chief Technical Integrity Officer. It's an executive-level advisory role with the pay and status of a VP, but with no administrative duties. I want you to be the final technical veto on all mission-critical systems." Daniel listened patiently, his hand resting on the machine he had just resurrected. He appreciated the respect, but the core of his life remained immovable. He smiled faintly. "Thank you, Ms. Kane. The offer is generous, but the answer remains the same. I cannot take on a full-time, high-level management role. The travel, the weekend demands, it interferes with my primary contract, being a dad." He held her gaze, setting his true, non-negotiable condition. "I will accept the Chief Technical Integrity Officer title and pay, but only if my work hours remain precisely 6:01 a.m. to 3:00 p.m., 4 days a week, with guaranteed flexibility for my son's schedule. My job must be about ensuring the truth, not managing meetings." Victoria, now operating from a position of respect rather than arrogance, did not hesitate. "Done. Consider it officially accepted. I will personally guarantee that schedule." She instructed her general counsel to draft the new contract immediately, ensuring the Daniel Foster clause, guaranteeing his flexible hours and ultimate technical veto, was non-negotiable and protected by executive mandate. Her next command was directed at her engineering staff. "From now on, the most important voice in the room is the one presenting verifiable facts, not the loudest one with the highest title. Our culture shifts today. We listen first, then we act. Anyone caught mocking or dismissing a colleague, regardless of their pay grade, is immediately reprimanded. We are eliminating the janitor who touches wires mentality forever." Mark, the young engineer who had ridiculed Daniel, approached him nervously after the meeting. "Mr. Foster," he mumbled, "could you maybe teach me how you heard the fault? I only know how to read the data." Daniel looked at the earnest, now humbled young man. "There's your first lesson, Mark. Don't look down on the quiet ones. They often see the things everyone else is too busy to notice. Start by getting your hands dirty and stop trusting screens entirely." Victoria, standing slightly apart, watched this exchange. She realized that by losing the initial battle of wills, she had won something far more valuable, a foundation of stability and integrity. She had learned to listen more than talk, replacing her brittle confidence with authentic humility. The data center continued to hum with its new, record-setting stability. The final bell approached. As Daniel prepared to leave, his phone vibrated with a text message, visible only to him. It was from his son. "Don't forget to pick me up, Dad. School's out at 3:15. Love you." At 3:00 p.m. precisely, Daniel Foster walked out of the Helix Dynamics facility. He was dressed in the same uniform, carrying the same lunch bag, and driving the same modest car. His title and salary were now executive level, but his routine remained unchanged. He left the center in the soft, receding light of the afternoon sun. Victoria Kane, standing by the vast, panoramic window of her recently restored office, watched him go. She made no attempt to call him back or interrupt his schedule. She knew the most important man in the company was now on his way to his most important job, being a father. Weeks turned into months. The Helix dynamic system operated with record-breaking stability, a direct result of Daniel's precise, preemptive technical audits. The Daniel Foster Clause was now whispered about in corporate circles as the foundation of the company's turnaround. One quiet afternoon, Victoria descended from her penthouse office. She didn't call ahead or schedule an appointment. She walked into the maintenance bay, an area she had never previously visited, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. She handed one to Daniel. There was no flirtation, no challenge, and no executive posturing. "I brought you coffee, Daniel," Victoria said, her voice soft and genuine. "You saved me from a multi-million-dollar mistake and from being a viral humiliation. Thank you for not shaming me further in front of my team." Daniel took the cup, nodding. "Everyone has a power outage, Ms. Kane. The difference is whether you learn to listen to the silence or just keep flipping the switch. You chose to listen." Just then, the outer security door chime signaled. Oliver, Daniel's 8-year-old son, burst into the maintenance bay, his face bright with excitement. He stopped, seeing the CEO, and politely offered a wave. "Hello, Ms. Kane." Victoria, who usually only spoke to people towering over her, immediately crouched down to the child's level, engaging him fully. It was a small, profound act of respect for Daniel's world, an acknowledgement of the true center of his gravity. A few minutes later, Daniel and Oliver walked out to the parking lot, their silhouettes long in the fading sunlight. The vast, gleaming Helix Dynamics data center stood behind them, its internal lights glowing with unwavering stability. Daniel looked down at his son, then back at the building, and whispered, more to himself than to Oliver, "Fixing a machine is easy. Fixing the way people look at others, that's the real work. And that," he added, squeezing Oliver's hand, "is what takes the most time." If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to Kind Single Father.